Scarlett stood in the hallway, blood hammering in her ears. She stared at the internal front door on the right, leading up to her Aunt Rebecca's apartment, her mind swimming with violent images. She pictured the police forensics team moving steadily and purposefully from room to room, their white suits rustling. What horrors they must have seen up there. The nausea that was never far from the surface rose up in her once more, but Scarlett willed herself to ignore it. She lifted her walking cane into the air and tentatively prodded the door with it, just to reassure herself it was locked. Then she turned her head away and walked along the short corridor to her own front door, past the post the police had piled onto the radiator shelf, and let herself in as fast as she could, pressing her back against the closed door and focusing on her breath. In to the count of 3, hold to the count of 3, out to the count of 3, and repeat. Apart from a slight mustiness, that strange stuffy sort of smell that came from the place having had no fresh air let in for almost a month, it wasn't as bad as she'd feared. This home had been her sanctuary for so long. She was determined it would remain so, despite what had happened upstairs. Only time would tell if she had the nerve for it. A strangulated sob erupted from Scarlett's mouth, and her cane fell to the floor. She raised her eyes to the ceiling. Little more than 6 feet from where she now stood, Clive Hamlin had brutally murdered her aunt. It was horrific, unimaginable. And yet she had been imagining it, in hideous and graphic detail, for how could she not? No matter how hard she tried to resist the compulsion, her mind kept taking her there, forcing her to watch various scenarios unfold, all of them ending the same way, with the baseball bat raining down blows on Rebecca's head. Even now, 4 weeks later, she still couldn't believe it had happened. Couldn't believe that Rebecca was actually dead. Scarlett bent down to retrieve her cane. A spasm of pain shot through the back of her left thigh like a red-hot skewer. She hobbled over to her green velvet sofa and sank into its comforting depths, put her legs up on the cushions, and laid back. She'd underestimated the stress of returning, the physical and mental toll it would exert on her. Why, after all these years, did her body still take her by surprise? As she began to relax, her mind returned to Clive. Quiet, ordinary Clive. Not stupid by any means, but hardly a match for Rebecca's intellect. When she'd first learned of their engagement, Scarlett had been surprised. She'd assumed that Rebecca would remain single. Her aunt was, as she herself had freely admitted on more than one occasion, an acquired taste. And Clive was nothing like the men she'd previously gone out with. Educated men who'd accompanied her to the theatre, to concerts. Men who'd enjoyed a lively debate with a forthright woman. Clive had left school at 16 to work in his father's electrical shop. Took over the business when he died. He was the sort of man who'd rather stay in and watch TV than go into town to see a play. He'd always been polite, attentive. But there'd been something not quite right about him. That's what Scarlett had told the police when they interviewed her. Something a little too attentive. As if he were trying too hard to get his feet under the table, as her dad had been fond of saying. Apparently, one of the neighbours told the police they'd heard him shouting at her in the garden the day it happened, and that they'd heard Rebecca crying. Scarlett sighed deeply and braced herself for the onslaught of self-recrimination. Why the hell hadn't she said anything? Why hadn't she expressed her reservations? Because Rebecca would have resented her interference. That's why. And when the woman she'd looked up to and loved all her life began to change, became forgetful and volatile, prone to odd delusions, Clive had been there, looking after her, supporting her. His dedication had been convenient. Scarlett closed her eyes. There, she'd admitted it at last. Scarlett shifted position on the sofa. She'd been 80 miles away in Bedford the night it happened, at a party she hadn't wanted to attend in the first place. Travel exhausted her, and she was never particularly keen on overnight stays in other people's houses. Rebecca had rung her earlier that day, while Scarlett was still on the train.